Welcome. My name is Alexa Noreen. I am the Virtual Content Specialist for Special Education ELA Grades 3 to 5. Today's lesson focus will be ELA Grade 5, Module 11, Day 5, HMH into Writing Realistic Story. The title for today's lesson will be Realistic Story. The focus question will be Write What You Know. The lesson objective will be to understand and practice using academic vocabulary such as setting, characters, plot, and conflict. The resource which I will be sharing with you will be used during the small guided group part of this lesson. During this time, the students will be working with the teacher to go over what are story elements. This is especially important because students will need to know what these are in order to write their stories. So it's essential for them to understand the concept of story elements prior to incorporating those elements into their own writing pieces. So let's get started. The resource which I will be focusing on is Nearpod. What is Nearpod? Nearpod helps educators make any lesson interactive, whether in the classroom or virtual. The concept is simple. A teacher can create interactive presentations that can contain quizzes, polls, videos, collaborate boards, and more. The first resource that we will be focusing on from Nearpod is a video on story elements. The video has multiple questions throughout the course of the video in which students will stop and answer. This is the video.
My grandpa thinks he's so funny. This morning at breakfast, he asked me if I knew what building in our town had the most stories. I told him it has to be our apartment building. Pretty much every other building in our town is only 1, 2, or 3 floors high. Ours is 8. He just shook his head, smirked, and said, "It's actually the library." Ugh, I mean, he's not wrong. The library has a lot more than 8 stories, even if they're all on 1 floor. There's short fiction, science fiction, fantasy, fairy tales, all under 1 roof. But what do all these different types of stories have in common? What makes a story a story?
Okay, boys and girls, what are some things all stories have in common? That is the first question. Students will write down their answers and teachers will go over some of their responses. Let's continue with the video.
It turns out all stories share 5 important elements. But where should we start? Oh, where? Every story has to take place somewhere, and that somewhere is called the setting. A story might take place in a desert or the snowy wilderness, a big city or a small town. Some stories take place in just 1 room. Setting isn't only about where, it's also when the story takes place. It could be set in modern times, 1,000 years in the past, or maybe the future. Some stories take place in one setting, while others move around. And setting affects the mood of a story. A dark, empty forest creates a different mood than a crowded, sunny beach.
The next question is, which of the following words has to do with the story's setting? The choices are what, who, where, when, or how, why. The correct, or where, why. The correct answer would be where, when. Let's continue with the rest of the video.
Okay, so setting is where and when. That doesn't sound like a full story. What's next? Characters, of course. Every story needs at least 1 character. Characters are the people in the story. Well, characters aren't only people. An animal, alien, or even an object can be a character. Most stories focus on one very important character called the main character. The main character in The Wonderful Wizard of Oz is Dorothy. Other characters are called secondary characters. The story may not focus on them as much, but they're still important. Some of my favorite characters are secondary characters. Dorothy's great, but for some reason, I just love the Cowardly Lion. Character traits are the qualities we use to describe characters, like cowardly. Other characters might be brave, or silly, or evil.
The next question is, think of a story you read recently. Name one character and a character trait that describes the character. Students will write down responses and teachers will go over some of these responses. Let's continue.
A setting with characters in it. But doesn't something have to, happen? Ah, the plot. The plot is the events that happen in a story. If someone asked you to summarize a story, you'd probably explain the plot. The beginning of a story is the introduction, or exposition. Readers usually learn about characters and a story's setting in the introduction. Events in a story typically build up to a climax, or the most exciting part. And plots tend to finish with a resolution. A resolution is how a story's conflict is resolved or comes to an end.
Okay, the next question is, what usually comes first in a story's plot? Is it climax, resolution, introduction, falling action? The correct answer is introduction. Let's continue.
Wait, conflict? What's that? Oh, another element of a story. A conflict is a problem a character or characters must face. It keeps the plot moving and adds tension. There are things the main character wants or needs to do, but something gets in the way of those things. That's the conflict. There are external and internal conflicts. An external conflict comes from the world around the character. External means outside. An internal conflict is a struggle inside a character's mind. Internal means inside.
True or false? An external conflict is a struggle inside a character's mind. The answer would be false. Let's continue.
Okay, a setting, characters, plot, conflict. That seems like a story to me, but there's one more element, and it's not always so obvious. The last element is a story's theme. A theme is an idea or message an author wants to get across with their story. It's usually a big idea about the world or life, and authors usually don't come out and tell you a story's theme. You have to infer a theme based on what you read. You can think about the plot or conflict or how characters change throughout the story to figure out the theme. Sometimes a story's theme will stick with you for a long time. It might even help you make sense of your own life story.
In 2 to 3 sentences, come up with the plot for a story that could have the following theme. Teamwork can help you achieve a goal. Now, this is the end of our video. As you have seen from the video, it explains a lot of different story elements. You can choose which story elements that you want to expose your students to at the pace that you see seems appropriate for your students. Now we will continue with a game that will be utilized for this lesson on story elements with your students. This is a game that students will be playing while they are practicing what are story elements. Students will be asked to match these pairs with the definition of the story element. You have conflict, plot, character, and setting. Now, these are the 4 story elements that you can begin with students. In this game, you can add as many pairs as you want and as many pairs as you expose your students to. Students will look at each word and match it to its definition. So, for example, conflict is the problem that is faced by the characters in the story. Plot is the main events that happen in the story. Characters are the people, animals, or things that are experiencing the events, and setting is the place where the story is happening. Students will get as many opportunities as needed to get all the answers correct. And like I said, you can add more pairs to this game as students are being exposed to more story elements. The last resource which I will be sharing with you is this graphic organizer that students can utilize when they're preparing to write their writing pieces. It will help the students organize their writing so they include the essential elements of a story. It has the characters, the setting, problem, the three events or more if they need space that happen in their story, and also the solution of the story. Once they have organized and mapped out their writing in this graphic organizer, they can utilize this as a starting point to do their realistic stories. So let's summarize what we did today. First, we utilized a video where students can learn more in depth about different story elements. We also talked about a game that students can play in which they can match story elements to their definitions, which will make it fun for students to practice and memorize the different story elements. Lastly, we looked at a graphic organizer that students can utilize when they're planning out their realistic stories. Now, why do we use all these resources and why do we use them, especially for our students with disabilities? We can provide our students with all the resources that they need and all the added support in order to be able to complete the task at hand. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you utilize some of these resources within your teaching practices. This is Oxanarine logging off. Happy teaching.